Welcome to this latest in the series of IISS webinars. My name is Adam Ward. I'm the Director of Studies at the IISS based in London, and I'm going to be chairing this debrief of the 15th IISS Shangri-La Dialogue, which was held over the weekend in Singapore. It was the 15th, as I've mentioned, and those 15 years have demonstrated that the dialogue is not only firmly established, but also embedded and rooted into the annual calendar of defence diplomacy in the region. It's a venue where defence ministers and selected heads of government can reliably meet to set out public positions, to hold private meetings in various combinations, and to be tested or indeed supported in their policies and responsibilities by the many leading defence intellectuals who are present, as well as by prominent members of the corporate sector who have a stake in the continued stability and security of a region that is still, after all, economically vibrant and growing in stature every year. It's fair to say, I think, that there was a special buzz to the dialogue this year, marked by the breadth and seniority of the delegations, by the attention it attracted from the global media, and by the sheer numbers of those who came as fully accredited delegates. That was also, it has to be said, a measure of the security and geopolitical challenges the region faces, an implicit contest featuring some explicit differences between China and America, the associated and increasingly emblematic issue of how the mounting tensions in the South China Sea are to be managed, even if they cannot be resolved, whether the North Korean threats and provocations of the last year can indeed be contained and deterred. But the Shangri-La dialogue was notable again this year also for its continuing search for common threats and shared problems that might form the basis for collaborative and cooperative action, and so to build a kind of countervailing confidence in the face of all those divisions and disputes. In the area of tackling violent extremism, in the area of irregular migration, in conflict resolution, and even in the cyber domain, and so on. Underpinning all the enumerated risks and all the possible opportunities for cooperation discussed at the Shangri-La dialogue is the question that looms perhaps largest. What sort of regional order is the Indo-Pacific moving towards, and indeed what forms of disorder might it have to contend with in the future? Now, to address these matters and others, I'm pleased to be joined from Singapore by Dr. Tim Huxley. Tim is the Executive Director of IISS Asia. He is in the fulcrum each year of preparing and organizing the dialogue, and he is therefore excellently placed to provide us with a survey of approximately 20 minutes or so of the key issues around the dialogue as he sees them. Once Tim has provided his presentation, we'll then enter into a discussion period. For those of you who want to make a statement or ask a question, and it's principally questions I think we're looking for, you can do that through the chat function that's provided. Those questions will come through to me. I'm going to select them and I'll put them to Tim. So now I'd like to hand over to my colleague Tim Huxley in Singapore. Tim.
Oh, thanks very much, Adam. Good evening or good morning to everyone who's listening in. As Adam said, we held the 15th Shangri-La Dialogue over the weekend from Friday evening to Sunday lunchtime, and our view is that it was a highly successful dialogue for the reasons that Adam mentioned, but particularly in the sense that this 15th Shangri-La Dialogue facilitated a discussion that was very open. And a wide range of views on regional security were aired freely by members of delegations that were powerful in terms of their makeup, and in many cases led by full ministers. We had 15 full ministers and about half that number again of deputy ministers at the dialogue. We had around 30 countries represented, and all in all about 50 nationalities in terms of the delegates. 13 ministers or their near equivalents spoke in 5 plenary sessions, We also had 6 special sessions looking at more specialized topics on the Saturday afternoon, and there were 4 speakers in each of those sessions, a number of whom were chiefs of defense forces, the CDS or CDF from Malaysia, Singapore, UK, Philippines, spoke in various of those special sessions, and a number of very senior officials as well. As Adam mentioned, I'm going to talk about some of the main themes that struck me as important in this year's Shangri-La Dialogue. I suppose one thing to say to start with is that this Shangri-La Dialogue was not only about China and the South China Sea, but predictably, given the current regional environment, China and the South China Sea was a major theme running through the event, and at issue is what China has been doing in the South China Sea over the last 2 or 3 years in terms of building up the various features that it occupies, and in many cases militarizing those features through building military infrastructure and deploying military units and hardware to those features. So just to start off with a few brief comments on this issue of the South China Sea. U.S. Defense Secretary Ash Carter gave a strong speech. I think one of the best that I've heard from a U.S. Defense Secretary over the last 14 years that I've been involved in the Shangri-La Dialogue, and he made the point that China, in his view and in the U.S. view, is erecting what he called a great wall of self-isolation in the South China Sea. In other words, that what China's policy practice in the South China Sea is clearly at odds with the policies of other powers which are involved in the region, whether they're regional states or countries which need to use the South China Sea for various purposes. So China is increasingly putting itself on the other side, as it were. But he also made the point that the US is committed to working with China to ensure what he called a principled future. And that expression, principled, came up almost 40 times during his speech and in his subsequent responses to questions. So this idea of principles and principled policy and principled behavior was absolutely central to his speech. And it's interesting that the day before the Shangri-La Dialogue, Ash Carter had spoken of Singapore as a principled security partner of the United States. I think the implication is that China has been behaving in an unprincipled way, or at least its principles are different from those of the United States and its allies and friends. And a number of other ministers agreed with Carter in their own comments on the South China Sea during their own plenary addresses. Ministers from Western countries, France and the UK, and from Japan, were particularly clear in the views that they expressed that the disputes in the South China Sea should be resolved peacefully. They should be resolved in accordance with international law, and that freedom of movement for shipping and overflying aircraft should be maintained and protected. And to some extent, regional states agreed with those views as well. China's position, which was expressed, of course, particularly by the leader of the Chinese delegation, Admiral Sun Jianguo, when he spoke in the 4th plenary session on Sunday morning, was, I suppose as we all expected, still trenchant in its assertion of China's claims in the South China Sea and China's right to do what it wants in terms of building on the features that it occupies and in terms of putting military facilities on those small features. What I see is that the second major theme of this Shangri-La dialogue was related to the first, and this second theme concerned the nature of the regional security order, particularly in terms of the structure of relations among regional states and between those states and the United States and other external players in the region. Whereas US Defense Secretary Carter talked about the American ideal of what he called a principled security network in the region, which would be open to all states, including China, as long as they played by the rules of the established regional order. I think it was evident that the reality in the region is one in which some regional states feel that they need to be very careful about maintaining a balance in their relations between, on the one hand, their connections with China, and on the other hand, their relations with the US. But at the same time, I think it's clear that maintaining that balance is becoming more difficult because of the circumstances in the region. There was no one at this dialogue was openly talking about aligning against China, but I think it was clear at this dialogue that there is a lot of hedging going on in terms of the behavior of regional states. A number of regional states are evidently acquiescing, at least to a degree, in efforts by the United States to strengthen its bilateral security relations with the region, with regional governments. And I'm thinking particularly about some Southeast Asian states, Singapore and Vietnam stand out, but also India. And at the same time, it's clear that the US is increasingly thinking about multilateral regional security collaboration. And Secretary Carter followed up a proposal that he made last year about establishing a Southeast Asian regional maritime security network in order to increase the collective capacity of regional states and the US to understand what is going on in the region in terms of shipping movements and other features of the regional maritime environment that have security implications. It does seem evident, did seem evident to the Shangri-La dialogue that security relations among regional states are strengthening, though I would say in rather a patchy fashion. Perhaps most importantly, Japan is expanding its security cooperation with Southeast Asian states, including the Philippines and Vietnam. Philippines and Vietnam, of course, being the two frontline countries in the South China Sea, facing China's increasing assertiveness there. But while the focus of the discussion was heavily on the South China Sea and the regional security order, there were other themes as well. For the first time in several years, the Republic of Korea's defense minister spoke at this dialogue, and we also had a special session on Thursday afternoon on the North Korean threat. And one significant statement was by South Korea's defense minister Han Min-koo, who said that he rejected what he called the insincere call by North Korea for dialogue in the absence of denuclearization. And Russia's defense minister Antonov said there was no military solution feasible on the Korean peninsula, and he made it very clear that Russia would not recognize North Korea's nuclear ambitions. there was, as Adam mentioned, there were some areas of discussion at the Shangri-La dialogue, including Korea to some extent, where the participating countries found that they had areas of substantial agreement, and another area, another regional security issue where there was quite a lot of agreement, consensus, was the area of terrorism and counterterrorism. And it was particularly striking this year that the Malaysian Defence Minister and the Singapore Defence Minister were really talking in very much the same way about the threat from Islamist terrorism, jihadi terrorism in the region, and they expressed particular concern over the threat from the Islamic State in the region, particularly in terms of Southeast Asians, mainly from Indonesia and Malaysia, going to Syria and Iraq to join the Islamic State and to support it, and in some cases to actively fight for it, and also particular concern over the danger from returning fighters from the Middle East. But I think that one thing that struck me about this discussion of terrorism that it wasn't perhaps as high profile as one might have expected. That perhaps other regional states were not in any way so convinced as Malaysia and Singapore that this is a strategic threat. So the discussions at the dialogue were wide-ranging. The overarching theme was, I think, essentially about the nature of the regional security order, the way that states are aligning, and the South China Sea was, as we expected, very much a focus. So those are my initial comments, and I'll be pleased to respond to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. We'll now, as you say, enter into the question and answer period. We have about a maximum of 40 minutes or so for that. And if anybody who is listening in wants to ask a question, please just get it in as soon as you can, so that we can accommodate as many of those questions as possible. The first question that we've got comes from Michael Hennessy, who is an Associate Vice Principal for Research at the Royal Military College of Canada. And his question is really about the extent to which, with the exception of China, there was much criticism at the dialogue concerning U.S. activity. Was there a sense from some countries that the U.S. was perhaps forcing issues in terms of making a riposte to some of China's activity in a way that was unhelpful? Did you come across any kind of view resembling that, Tim?
It's a good question, Adam. But the interesting thing is there wasn't really much of a sense that the U.S. was behaving in any way unreasonably. Now, that doesn't mean that every state in the region was totally on board with the United States, and I think one could detect in the remarks by Southeast Asian ministers in the plenary sessions that there was perhaps a sense of still a strong sense of reserve about alignment with the United States, and I suppose that was most obvious in comments by the Malaysian minister and the Indonesian minister, to some extent by Thailand's Prime Minister in his in his keynote address on the Friday evening, when he was stressing the notion of the need for equilibrium in relations between states in the Asia Pacific. But there was no direct criticism of the U.S. role, except of course the oblique criticism that we've become used to in comments from the Chinese side.
Thanks, Tim. We have another question, this time concerning the ruling in the arbitration case between China and the Philippines. That is expected to come possibly in July. It had been thought that it might happen before the Shangri-La dialogue. It didn't. But the question concerns that assuming, it's not certain of course, but assuming that the ruling in that arbitration case goes in favor of the Philippines, what was the sense about how China might react to that, how it might demonstrate its rejection of the verdict?
Well, there was some discussion of this, but I think the discussion was taking place more on the sidelines of the dialogue, and then in an informal way around the dialogue, rather than in the formal sessions. Although, Adam, you were chairing the session on the South China Sea, and I wasn't there, so you may have things may have been said in that session that could contribute to an answer to this question. But
yes, I did actually directly pose that question of how China would demonstrate its rejection of such a ruling. I posed that to the Chinese speaker from the PLA, but I didn't get a clear answer to that.
Yeah.
Perhaps it was
okay. Well, I've got some points to make in response anyway. One is that it is a bit of an assumption that the ruling will go totally in favor of the Philippines, because the ruling may be a mixed one, because the Philippine case concerns a number of points, and the ruling may not be entirely positive from the Philippines' perspective, and I think there are grounds for thinking that some elements of the ruling might not be entirely helpful for the Philippines, and might even be to some extent helpful for the Chinese side. So I think we mustn't assume that it's going to be a black and white judgment, and of course that then has implications for how China might respond, and it might temper China's response. The Chinese have made it clear from the beginning that they don't recognize the legitimacy of the Philippines submission, and they're not going to play any part in it, and they're not going to accept the ultimate judgment. If the judgment was strongly against them, I suppose there's a case that they might react more strongly, and there's been some speculation about what they might do. They might declare an air defense identification zone over at least part of the South China Sea, perhaps the northern part, where it would be more feasible for them to enforce it, or they might rather ostentatiously start construction, dredging and construction on Scarborough Shoal, and then put military infrastructure there, which would be of direct concern to the Philippines. But of course, if the ruling was more of a mixed ruling, then the Chinese response might simply be one of not responding strongly.
Good. We have another question now from Stefan Busch, who is with AstraZeneca, and he asks you to reflect a little bit on how India played itself into the Shangri-La dialogue. We have this year, of course, had the Indian Defence Minister present, which has not always been something that the Shangri-La dialogue has featured. But maybe you could just reflect on that a bit.
Yeah, well, we were very pleased that the Indian Defence Minister came to the dialogue, and that he spoke in the second plenary session on managing military competition in the region. Now, I suppose the context for this is that for the last generation, in India has talked about looking east, about becoming more involved, not just economically but also in diplomatic and security terms in the affairs of Southeast Asia and East Asia, and in effect becoming a more significant actor in regional political and security affairs, and we've seen that through, to some extent, diplomatically, through India's engagement in the East Asia Summit and the ADMM Plus Defence Ministers meeting, but in some ways India is still rather a lightweight player for a major power in this region. So it's good that the minister came and spoke at the dialogue, but I think there was still a sense of perhaps hesitancy in the way that India played itself into this dialogue. I think there was, whereas Secretary Carter talked about a strategic handshake with India, and there's a sense of, I think, still a sense of great optimism on the American side about developing strategic relations with India, and India becoming a more important player to its east. I think Minister Parikar's speech still, I think he still indicated I think he still indicated a more traditional Indian viewpoint on international and regional security, perhaps without the clear definition of where India's interests might ultimately lie that some in the US and the West might have liked.
Thanks. Earlier on in your presentation, you noted the prevalence of hedging activity among the Southeast Asian states, and just prior to the Shangri-La dialogue, there was a sense of a Chinese initiative to peel away some of the continental members of ASEAN who are not as invested in the South China dispute from the maritime members who are. I think there's been some variations of interpretation as to how serious or how successful that initiative was, whether it was intended as such or not. Could you just sort of clear some of that up from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. Well, I suppose that the first thing I'd say is that we have to be a bit careful about categorizing the Southeast Asian countries into continental and maritime blocks, because that isn't really the case. Vietnam, of course, is a continental, well, it's the biggest continental Southeast Asian state, and its interests are clearly being very strongly challenged by China in the South China Sea, and also there are in this particular case, one of the states involved was Brunei, which is a claimant state in the South China Sea, and is very much a maritime Southeast Asian state. So I think what this was about was that China was trying to separate some of the smaller states of Southeast Asia, which perhaps were, in China's view, easier to manage than some of the larger Southeast Asian powers. So there was a statement from Wang Yi several weeks ago in which he claimed that Cambodia, Laos and Brunei had agreed with China that disputes in the South China Sea should be managed on a bilateral basis between the Southeast Asian countries concerned and China, rather than the South China Sea disputes being a matter for ASEAN to become involved in. So of course what China is very concerned about is ASEAN standing up to China as a bloc, because of course it will be much more difficult for China to deal with Southeast Asian countries if they showed some coherence and acted through ASEAN. But in this case, I think it misfired because in the first place, none of the three small Southeast Asian countries concerned issued statements to say that they agreed with China. In fact, subsequently, Cambodia issued a statement repudiating what Wang Yi had said, and we understand from our own contacts with one of the other countries involved that they certainly had not agreed with China in advance of Wang Yi's statement. And there have been one or two other cases recently. The Chinese issued a statement in which they said Fiji agreed with their position. The South China Sea disputes should be dealt with on a bilateral basis, and subsequently the Fijian government issued a statement again repudiating what China had said against them and saying that China had either misunderstood or misrepresented Fiji's position. So I think to some extent China's attempt to suborn these smaller regional states has backfired.
Some of the hedging activity, I guess, also extends to a number of, I suppose, what we could call invested but still extra-regional powers who took part in the Shangri-La dialogue. I'm thinking here of France and the UK, who are, of course, formal allies of the United States, who are seeking to signal their willingness to respond to the security concerns of a number of Southeast Asian states, and have talked about the way in which they want to make a direct, practical security contribution. But of course there's also countries seeking to establish more flourishing relationships on an economic basis with China. Then there was Russia, which is a strategic partner of China, but didn't seem to have a huge amount of appetite to get in the middle of Vietnam, with whom Russia obviously hopes to have closer defense industrial relations, put it that way, and China. Can you just take us through some of the way in which those dynamics express themselves in the dialogue?
Well, I think what you say is accurate. Russia's position is particularly awkward because clearly while seeking to be a strategic partner for China, they're simultaneously seeking to be a strategic partner for Vietnam. And I think it's not. You're right that there's a defense export angle to that, but I think there's more to it. There is more to the Russian-Vietnamese relationship than just simply defense exports. Russia is a long-term partner of Vietnam, and there's a high level of trust between the two countries. So I think Russia. You're right. Russia has sought to stay clear of that. The British and French positions were interesting because they were clearly very close to the American position on the South China Sea and on the rule of law and upholding existing norms. And I think it's clear that that in the future we can expect European countries, and particularly France and the UK, to probably follow in the wake of American freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, of course on a much more sporadic and usually much smaller scale than anything that the US could do. But I think we can probably expect to see other Western countries following the American example and demonstrating that they will continue to sail and fly wherever they want to.
One of the countries that was absent this year, but which has been a very loyal and constant participant in the Shangri-La dialogue, is Australia. And of course, there are particular political and electoral issues surrounding that. But Australia accounts as one of the middle powers in Asia, which has been highly active in regional security affairs. And we have a question from Ramganish Kamatham, who hasn't given us his affiliation, but I would invite him to do that via the chat function, about whether we saw anything by way of middle power coalitions forming, ostensibly led by Australia or featuring Australia in the manner that we've seen in previous dialogues.
Well, as you say, certainly not led by Australia at this dialogue, because the minister wasn't there, and the Australian delegation was very low key. So, for example, in previous years, we've seen a trilateral meeting at the dialogue between the U.S. Defense Secretary and the Japanese and Australian defense ministers, and that trilateral ministerial meeting couldn't happen this year. And there's also at each Shangri-La dialogue now a breakfast meeting of the defense ministers from the 5 power defense arrangements countries, and this year Australia was not represented by the minister but by its ambassador in Singapore. So this was the first time in 15 years that Australia has not been represented at ministerial level, and of course there is a very particular reason, because of the general election in Australia at the beginning of July. However, having said that, yes, I think there is a sense that the regional security order is under challenge, and that those states which have benefited from and wish to uphold the existing order are beginning to coalesce through various mechanisms, and I think that those other countries that might form part of a loose coalition in response to Chinese pressure around its maritime littoral were of course active through their bilateral meetings with the US and with each other at this dialogue. But at this stage, I think it's a form of hedging rather than some sort of proto-alliance in the Asia Pacific.
Thanks. I'll just take this opportunity now, since we only have a maximum of 20 minutes left, to encourage those who are listening who want to ask a question to do so in the usual way. And while we're waiting for some more questions to come in, perhaps, Tim, I can ask you another one on this question of regional order. Clearly, throughout the whole of the weekend, there was some pretty unambiguous signaling going on and very clear statements made about forms of behavior that are thought to be acceptable and kinds of relationships that are considered to be productive or not. But there was also in some ways a sense in which some delegations may have been sort of talking past each other. I'm thinking in particular about the incident on Sunday where Admiral Sun Jianguo, the Deputy Chief of the Joint Staff Department of the Central Military Commission in China, who was the head of their delegation, made a number of references to the regional order as being one that features lots of exclusive bodies, and this seemed to puzzle the Minister of Defense of Singapore, Dr. Ng, who publicly expressed his bafflement at the Chinese description there, and it was not always customary to see the Chinese and the Singaporean delegations adhering to rather different conceptions on such a fundamental point. Do you want to just address that? Did that strike you as unusual?
Yes, I mean that was yes. I think you're quite right to highlight that, because it was significant, and I think that the Singapore minister's reaction to that demonstrates the extent to which there is concern in this region, even among those countries which have traditionally been fairly sympathetic to China's growing regional and international role. I think there is concern that China is not integrating itself into the existing structures in the way that many had hoped, and I think there's a growing sense that when the Chinese talk about being excluded, that actually they're not being excluded, but they're excluding themselves, because they have been behaving in a way which has been disturbing for other regional states, and they've demonstrated on occasion that they don't accept the regional norms of behaviour, and so that was an interesting moment of tension towards the end of this dialogue.
One of the subjects that you alluded to in the early part of your presentation was that of the threat of jihadi terrorism in Asia, and it was interesting to me that there were quite a number of people at the dialogue who seemed to suppose that jihadi terrorism was a subject that countries of the region like to talk about, because it meant that they didn't have to talk about other more sensitive issues. And there again, there were other people who thought, no, actually this is a growing and a legitimate and considerable concern of the countries in the region. What's your assessment there?
Well, my assessment is it's a serious security threat, particularly in Indonesia and Malaysia and Singapore, because it's sandwiched between Malaysia and Indonesia, and because Singapore is particularly vulnerable because it has a very dense population and potentially fragile urban infrastructure, and depends on a high degree of regional and international confidence in its resilience, so that it can remain a centre for finance and so on. But I don't think that jihadi terrorism is a strategic threat to even those countries. This is a threat that needs to be handled through police work and through intelligence exchanges and through monitoring of people who are affiliating themselves with the Islamic State, but violent extremism has been part of the security landscape in Southeast Asia for most of the post-1945 period, to a greater or lesser degree, and governments in this region have shown quite a significant capacity for managing violent internal security threats, and I think that's particularly true in the Indonesian case, where in the years after the 9/11 attacks, from around 2002 to 2006, Indonesia suffered a series of quite major terrorist attacks in Bali and in Jakarta, and the government responded sensibly and effectively, and managed the threat from Jemaah Islamiyah and effectively destroyed Jemaah Islamiyah as a serious threat. And now there's a new wave of terrorism, and it seems to me that the Indonesian authorities are again showing considerable confidence and competence in managing this threat without overreacting. So I think there are much bigger security problems in this region for governments to worry about.
Yeah. We talked a little time ago about European countries and power projection into the region. This isn't necessarily a question about the Shangri-La dialogue, but it's one that's come in from William Kuchera, hope I pronounced that correctly, from the Australian Institute of Professional Intelligence Officers, who alludes to the story in the paper today about the Type 45 engine problems affecting the Royal Navy, and what that might herald in terms of the ability to operate in the South China Sea, or generally in support of British FPDA commitments.
Well, yeah, it's an interesting. I saw that story, but I think it's I think it's a straw in the wind, really. The Type 45 destroyer has deployed to this region. There was one here a couple of years ago, and I don't think there were any problems. So I'm sure that when the Royal Navy has its new carriers, they'll make sure that the engines work well enough for global deployments and are able to operate in hot weather environments. And I thought one of the interesting things that the UK's Defence Secretary Michael Fallon said in his plenary address was that the two Royal Navy Queen Elizabeth class carriers will be sailing these seas, as he put it, and I think once those carriers are in service from around 2020 onwards, that we will see them in this part of the world.
Good, thanks, Tim. Let me just pose a final question to you, just to invite you to make a final reflection, either on the point of whether there was anything in particular that really caught you by surprise about the Shangri-La dialogue this year, or indeed whether, having come out of the weekend, you were left with any great sense of what next year's dialogue might aim to get to grips with.
Sorry, I missed that last question, Adam.
Whether you had any sense of the sort of questions that you think the agenda next year should feature on the basis of some of the stuff that was covered this year.
Oh, okay. Well, I think in terms of surprise, for me, honestly, there were no big surprises, but perhaps a mild surprise that so many of the ministerial addresses were, I suppose you could say, on the same wavelength as the U.S. Defense Secretary's address, and I think this is something that the Chinese really need to take note of. That the Americans are not alone in saying that freedom of navigation and freedom of overflight in the South China Sea important, and and that the U.S. is not alone in pushing back against China. And I think it's particularly interesting that the British and French ministers were so clear in what they said, and also the Korean minister Han Ming-koo was very clear in what he said about the South China Sea. So there was no sense in which countries which have strong economic relations with China were in some way muted because of that economic relationship. So I think that was quite significant. In terms of what sort of questions should be on the agenda for next year's dialogue, well, I think that's going to be. I think next year's agenda is going to be very much influenced by what happens over the coming months. So the South China Sea issue is clearly not going to go away. The issue of the regional order is clearly not going to go away, because the regional order is evidently going to remain in flux. The Korean issue is not going to be resolved. Terrorism is going to be a continuing issue. So I think many of the themes that were on the agenda for this year's Shangri-La Dialogue are enduring themes that are going to continue to be part of the agenda for next year.
Good. Thank you very much, Tim. I should note that in addition to his responsibilities regarding the Shangri-La Dialogue, Tim is also typically the editor of the annual regional security assessment of security developments in the Asia Pacific that the IISS produces in tandem with the Shangri-La Dialogue. And anybody who's listening into this can get more information about that, and indeed access to it via the IISS website. On the website you'll also find a policy paper produced by the IISS that looks at EU policy options in terms of security and defense issues towards Southeast Asia. That was also something that we launched at the Shangri-La Dialogue this year, and created a good deal of interest, I think. And then finally, to alert IISS members and others to the fact that the latest, or the rather not quite the latest, but the one before that, a Delphi book to be produced by the Institute is on the subject of China's cyber power, and that is a very powerful essay written by Nigel Inkster, and I would commend that to you. So I'll bring this discussion to a close now. I want to thank you all for joining us today and for your participation in the discussion. A recording of this webinar is going to be made available on our website and at the IISS YouTube channel within 2 days or so. And the YouTube channel is also where you can find video footage of the keynote address of the Shangri-La Dialogue, the 5 plenaries, as well as a number of highlights from the weekend as a whole. So thank you very much indeed. Look forward to welcoming you to the next IISS webinar series, but from London and from Singapore, it's goodbye.